Okay, so I said last time, think about what principles you would choose from this original position. And I'll get into that in a second, but I do just want to say a little bit about, the defense of this original position, because one of the things we're going to ask ourselves is, well, how much should this matter, right? How much should it matter what principles we would pick from the original position? That's going to be a challenge that Nozick will level at Rawls. So I do think it is worth saying a bit about why Rawls thinks the original position is important. And that just is, he thinks it models this sort of fundamental idea to a democracy that we're all free and equal in some sense, right? Everybody gets to make this decision. Nobody is more important than anybody else. The original position is a way to model that, right? And it also, this is very much part of Kantianism. Everybody is free, everybody deserves respect. The original position is supposed to get at that too, right? And, if we can really get principles from the original position that everyone agrees to, that seems to fit with the formula of universal law, then, Rawls would say, we have a society that can make a good claim to respect everybody. Okay, so we'll come back to that because Nozick will push pretty hard on this. And I do think there's some criticisms to be made of the original position, but it's certainly not silly. There are some deep motivations here. This is, to my mind at least, a more attractive way to think about justice generally and distributive justice more specifically than is this sort of utilitarian approach. Okay, so let's move on and ask ourselves, what principles would you choose? I said think a bit last time, what kinds of protections you would want, well, let's get into that. So Rawls says we would choose two principles from the original position. One would govern the basic rights. If you were writing a Bill of Rights for your society, that's what the first principle kind of gets at. I'll talk a bit about the first principle. I'm going to put more weight, more time into the second one, because the second one is the one that really talks about this question of distributive justice. It's also the one that's much more controversial. But let's say a little bit about the first principle. So the first principle, Rawls says that you would basically want to protect basic rights in your society, like the kinds of basic rights you see protected in the Bill of Rights to our Constitution and the post-Civil War amendments. Bill of Rights, freedom of religion, freedom of the press, freedom of speech, protection against unreasonable search and seizures by the police. They have to have a warrant or, in some other context, at least due cause to search you. If not, they can't do that, right? You can choose what religion you want. The government can't outlaw religion just because people don't like it. That's protected, right? Due process. We can't deprive you of liberty as a society without a trial or some other due process, right? In fact, we can't deprive you of anything of value without some kind of due process. Right to property. People have a right to own property, right? Post-Civil War amendments, slavery and other forms of indentured servitude are banned, right? Rawls thinks all of that would go into the first principle. Rawls is not a great writer. If you actually read Rawls, he puts this in a really roundabout way. But basically, the idea is that you want some basic rights like you find in the Bill of Rights and those post-Civil War amendments. Well, why is that? Why would you want protections like that from the original position? Well, it's not too hard to realize. It's not too hard to see why that is, right? Why wouldn't you want the society to be able to harass a religion that people don't like? Well, because you might come out and find you're a member of that religion and that religion is really important to you, right? Simply by looking, simply from looking out for yourself, you would want to ensure freedom of religion, because if you're a member of an unpopular religion, you want protection, you want to be able to freely practice your religion. Free speech, you might come out and find that you have a really unpopular opinion that is really important to you. You want speech to be protected, right? Search and seizure, due process, you might come out and find the original position and find that you are, for whatever reason, type of person that the cops like to harass, that, maybe society wants to put away, right? You would want protections that keep them from harassing you and would make sure that you can't be imprisoned or whatever, or deprived of life or liberty without a trial or some other kind of process, right? All of that stuff, it's pretty easy to see why you would want it protected from the original position. Not going to say a whole lot more about the first principle, because mainly we want to talk about this issue of distributive justice. It really doesn't touch on it. And also just because the first principle really isn't super controversial. Even people who don't agree with Rawls' overall argument, even people who push back strongly on the second principle of justice, which governs inequality, tend to like the first principle. All right. So let's get into the second principle. What rules, what restrictions maybe on inequality would you choose from the original position? Well, one thing you might say is just to say, well, no rules whatsoever. We've got the first principle. We don't need anything else. In fact, that's what guys like Nozick, that's what a lot of libertarians will say, right? Who cares about inequality? Let's just let the market do its magic. Well, why would you not want to say that from the original position, right? Market just does whatever. If you're poor, if no one wants to pay you to do anything, who cares? Not the business of the government to step in on that stuff. If you just end up starving, well, you end up starving, right? Why, from the original position, would you want society to make some kinds of provisions for the poor? Why would you want some rules about the kind of support society has to provide the poor? Think about that for a second. Why not just full-on free market, no restrictions on inequality, no provisions, no rules about what society has to do to help the poor? Well, it's the same kind of reasoning why you would want protections for religion or due process or any of that, right? You might come out and find that society likes to harass people like you. You want due process. You want protections from unreasonable search and seizure. You might come out of the original position and find that your religion is really unpopular. Well, you want protections for your religion in case of that. Well, the same with inequality. You might come out of the original position and find that you are not just poor, but desperately poor. You might be the poorest of the poor. And if you are, you might even just find not only are you poor, but you don't particularly have any talents or any abilities that people want to buy. There's not much you can do to even pull yourself up out of poverty, right? Because that is a possibility, Rawls would say you would want some rules governing inequality. You would want society to have some rules about what provisions it has to make for the poor. Because you might be poor. Well, so look, one response to that worry, from the original position, might be to spring to the other side, right? Like a kid learning to drive who drives his car in the ditch, maybe we just whip the wheel and go to the other side, right? If you probably guessed from the metaphor I'm using, I guess that's a simile, but if you might guess from the simile I'm using, this isn't a great idea, but let's talk about it, right? How about we just go with communism with relation to income and property? By communism, I mean everybody, no matter what they do, earns exactly the same amount of money. Well, Rawls is interesting because Rawls actually says from the original position, we wouldn't choose that either. Why not? You might come out and find that you're desperately poor. That would really stink. So wouldn't, full-on communism protect you from that? Wouldn't it deal with that worry? Rawls will say no. Rawls actually says, strict communism, everybody earns the same amount of money, will almost certainly be worse for everybody. No matter who you are, even if you are the poorest of the poor, that's not going to be a good society for you. Well, why not? Well, ask yourself this. Let's just think about doctors, right? How much training do you have to do to become a doctor? A lot. How smart do you have to be a doctor? Very, right? You have to put in all this work, years and years and years of medical school, then residency on top of, your regular education. Well, and we want the very best and brightest doing that, right? We don't want Dr. Nick from The Simpsons. I don't know if you guys have never seen Dr. Nick from The Simpsons. Look it up. He's pretty funny. He's actually a joke about the doctor who, prescribed Elvis the pills who killed Elvis, but anyway. And so Rawls would say, look, if everybody earned the same amount of money, would enough smart people want to, say, be doctors or not, right? In our society, we're imagining everybody earns the same amount of money. The doctor who has to work for years and years and years earns the same amount of money as, let me just take the easiest job I can imagine, which is the card swipe at the gym. I think they're automating these jobs in a lot of places, right? But I knew a guy in college who had this job, actually the same lazy guy I talked about earlier. It's a perfect job for him, right? And you just sit there, you read your magazine, every now and then somebody comes in, you swipe their card. Maybe, if they're really demanding, they want a key to a locker, and you got to find a key to a locker, but mostly you just sit there, read your magazine, low stress, whatever, right? If the guy who swipes the cards at the gym earns the exact same amount of money as a doctor, well, most smart people are going to want to be card swipers at the gym, right? There might be a few people who are just so nice, so idealistic, they want to help people, are just so interested in medicine that they become doctors anyway, but you're not going to have enough smart people who want to go into medicine if you don't pay doctors more money. And Rawls will say, think about inventions, right? Inventions like the light bulb or whatever, or, coming up with new medicines. People are not going to spend all that time working, all that time getting education, all that time away from their families, in the basement working on the light bulb or in the lab working on whatever, if they don't get some kind of monetary reward for it, if they don't get some money. So in a society where we have strict equality, we're probably not going to have enough doctors, we're not going to have inventions. Basically, Rawls said we will all be poor, right? We need some inequality as an incentive for the talented people to develop their talents and contribute. Not enough of them are going to do it out of the goodness of their heart. You look at actual communist societies, they are really poor, not good for anyone, right? So Rawls says as an incentive, we will allow some inequality. Even if you come out of the original position and find you're the poorest person in society, it's going to be better for you if we allow some incentive for smart people to develop and use their talents. So we allow some inequality, but any inequality we meet must meet some strict conditions. Rawls, at one point, if you actually go read Rawls, he says, well, any inequality must be to the benefit of everyone. Well, and you might say to yourself, well, what does that mean? Well, Rawls gives a very specific interpretation of what it is for an inequality to be for the benefit of everyone. This is his second principle of justice. Any inequality we allow in society has to satisfy two conditions. A, it has to allow for real equality of opportunity. Everybody has to have, subject to talent and willingness to work hard, the same chances, and the least well-off person must be as well-off as possible. You look at the poorest person in society, could they be doing better? If the answer is yes, the inequalities are not justified. Now, we'll talk a lot more about what each of these mean in the next lecture.